experience I'm trying to figure out with these kinds of projects is how do you apply DJ technique to radically different medium, which means montage, which means collage, bricolage, and all these kinds of fractured and fragmented narratives that we now are all calling home. So the webs and networks that really sustain this kind of global information economy are something that I think poetry can engage, art can engage, and just look at from a lyrical point of view. So over the course of the last several years, I've worked with people like Amiri Baraka, Allen Ginsberg. Allen Ginsberg's estate gave me his voice, but we did a project a couple of years ago. It was like a weird poetry thing. But the beat poets, which are a big inspiration for me. Amiri Baraka was fun. I did the first DJ mixes with him. And one of the questions he always kept asking, he's like, why does all this DJ stuff and this hip hop repeat? Which is a really interesting question. So repetition, difference, again, going back to those Deleuzian connections, how do those look at the creative act of anyone living in a global environment, which is us all? Amiri Baraka is somebody I think has really had a great kind of relationship to what I like to call the urban discourse. So going back to those trains that I started my discussion with, I want to just ask you guys, how many of you know Garrett A. Morgan? Anybody? No? Wow. Oh, two. He's a very renowned African-American inventor. And he invented the streetlight that regulates movement in pretty much almost every aspect of the urban landscape. So, red, yellow, green, start, stop, slow down. That's a kind of urban choreography. It's the body moving with the city and also moving with the actual movement of people and the circulation of goods in the landscape that we've created. It's a place where the artificial landscape of the city intersects with the human body. So, red, yellow, green. In 1923, he was on his way home and saw a Model T Ford car hit a horse carriage in the middle of an intersection. And he was like, why do the streets have no sense of regulation? You have to remember back at that time period, if you were in Shanghai or if you were in Berlin or if you were in London, people were riding bicycles around, there were horses, cars coming by. There was no control. People would just kind of look and make sure they hoped they didn't get hit. So by making the street light, there was a kind of a radical intervention of a control mechanism into urban movement. It's about giving pattern and structure to the urban landscape. So what ends up happening is that now whenever you're in a city anywhere on the planet, the street light is a kind of a choreographic intervention. People move, they start, they stop, they slow down, but it creates this kind of dynamic between the subjective, I think, ideas of what it means to live in this kind of public space of the urban landscape. The Greeks like to call this the agora, the public space in the middle of the city. But for us, that is the new networks that's been dispersed and made into all these roads that we use. By the way, he was also one of the first black millionaires because he invented hair straightening cream. It's a long story. But I'm sure if you guys know Outkast and like the Hey Ya song or any of that kind of stuff, or Farnsworth Bentley. So I want to draw that back to this idea of the sound system as well. What you see behind me is a very rare photograph of Arthur Duke Reid, who's a Jamaican producer who was the first to really pull this idea of the sound system and the networks of a kind of a third world economy like Jamaica to create a displacement of the performance again. So the record became the actual performance. People no longer referred to bands almost at all anymore except as producers of records. So that's in 1960. Now if we go further back to 1915, you have the Italian futurists with their idea of the intono rumori, or the noise generators. So what you're seeing here is the loud sounds displaced from a performance. Let's go from Jamaica to avant-garde Italy, and look at how these kinds of production processes were about displacement of the physical, looking at the actual recording and how the recording itself was no longer related to the physical anymore. So what I'm drawing a connection here is how much culture is now lived through these kinds of recorded projection devices and multimedia. So as an artist, whether it was Antarctica or whether it was Rebirth of a Nation, also last year I was in the Venice Biennial, and I went to Angola, which just ended a 20-odd-year civil war based on the kind of oil, gold, and diamonds. It was amazing. There was something like 30,000 plus Chinese in downtown Luanda because of the China Petrol Corporation, CPC. There's only 2 African members of OPEC, for example, Angola and Nigeria. So anyway, when you're walking through a city like that and you see some of the processes that go on with bootleg culture and how people respond to cultural production, that's a big inspiration for me. It's not about New York anymore, it's not about Berlin or Tokyo or London. It's more about places like Calcutta or Sri Lanka or kind of Sao Paulo or Recife or Cape Town or, for that matter, Luanda. So what other cultures are doing with this idea of bootleg culture is really saying no to a whole regimen of the idea of control of physical products. Copyright culture, as we know it, usually focuses on control mechanisms dealing with physical products. But software is very hard to contain and control. As soon as something's made, there's a hack. So the pun here is that music is usually kind of a cultural software. It's something that people exchange and trade, like the network I just made by giving you all the different materials. But it's also a kind of cultural currency, and it looks at different kinds of cultural production that relate to this idea of dematerialization and exchange. So there's a parallel going on, like I was drawing with the subway system at the beginning and the internet. It's not about normal code hacking, but social hacking, what they call social engineering, all puns intended. Now, the phonograph really displaced so much of previous history's relationships to physical production methods because people felt that once they had the recording, they really didn't necessarily need to engage with the live thing anymore. So Indians, or Italian futurists, or Thomas Edison's notes for the World Trade Fairs, all of those are part and parcel of how people slowly became to experience the reality of recordings as displacing the reality of literally reality itself. So if we fast forward, I'm going to skip ahead a little. Yeah. 1, 2, hold on a second. All right. And I want to show 2 films by Nam June Paik and 1 film of Rebirth of a Nation. Hold on a second. So, when I got the rights to G.W. Griffith's film, one of the things that really amazed me was that it was one of the first films to really be portrayed as a true thing. I'm going to play 2 examples of a very short film. One is Méliès, who was a magician who became a filmmaker. And this is something I use as a kind of description. So sorry for my class, you guys are going to see a 1-minute thing that's, you'll get the idea. But sampling and the idea of acoustic experience, and again, playing with memory. Something that's been resonant with many cultures over the last several centuries, but the way the records and the way film as a document played with truth is something that really became a function of propaganda and other kinds of manipulation of public opinion with Birth of a Nation. So if we go back to the beginning of the 19th century in French cinema, you had the Lumiere brothers and the Méliès. Méliès was someone who was a magician who became a filmmaker, and he wanted to apply magic technique to film. What you're going to see here is he's made copies of himself that are in a sense of choreography with one another. So here we go.
En 1900, il y a donc presque 100 ans, Méliès représente ce qu'il était réellement dans la vie, un homme orchestre.